The quiet dreamer, she sat quietly at the back of the room, almost invisible, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her coffee cup. The sound of laughter, conversations, and clinking glasses filled the air, but she was content to just observe. People crowded around in small groups, talking animatedly, their voices rising and falling in the background. She could hear snippets of their discussions, plans for the future. Personal achievements, the latest news, but she didn't feel a part of it. In the middle of this bustling world, she was like a shadow, quietly sipping her drink, her mind elsewhere. She wasn't shy, not really, but there was something inside her that always kept her a step removed from the noise. It was like there was an invisible wall between her and the others, a barrier that she couldn't quite break through. And yet she didn't mind. Her thoughts weren't on the conversation at hand, nor were they focused on the group of people around her. No, her mind was elsewhere, drifting to something much more personal. The piano. The one thing that could truly pull her from the quiet depths of her own world. She had always loved music. It was in her bones. But it wasn't the kind of love you could share in the loud, busy world of parties and social gatherings. Music was her secret, her safe place. The soft melody that played in her mind was something only she knew. Something only she could hear. In those rare moments, when she found herself alone, it was the piano that spoke to her. It was where she could let go of the world and just breathe. She could still remember the first time she sat down at the piano. The sound of the keys, smooth and soft as her fingers brushed across them, creating a song of her own. The joy it brought her was unlike anything else, but that was years ago. Now, the piano sat in the corner of her small apartment, gathering dust. She practiced in silence, alone, away from the world. She didn't share her music with anyone who would care. It wasn't just the piano that remained hidden. Her dream was tucked away in the corners of her mind, wrapped in a blanket of self-doubt. She had always dreamed of playing on stage, of sharing her music with the world, but the thought of standing in front of others, of being seen, terrified her. What if they didn't like her music? What if they laughed at her? The fear had kept her from trying, from even considering the idea of stepping into the light. She didn't tell anyone about her dream, not because it was a secret, but because it felt too fragile, too vulnerable. It was like a fragile bird in her chest, one she was too afraid to let free. So, she kept it locked away, telling herself it wasn't practical, that people didn't need to hear it. After all, who was she? A quiet woman in the corner, dreaming of something that was never meant to be. As the night went on, she found herself retreating even more into her thoughts. The conversations around her grew louder, but the noise didn't bother her. She had learned to shut it out. She let the words of others blur together until they became nothing more than background noise. She could feel the pull of the piano in her mind again. A quiet, gentle tug was calling her even though she was still. Surrounded by people, she thought about it often. That piano in the corner of her apartment, sitting untouched for days, weeks. Sometimes she would walk by it, her fingers brushing over the keys, but she never played. It felt too risky. She didn't want to fail. She didn't want to disappoint herself. And yet in those quiet moments when she was alone, the music would come back to her, softly at first, then stronger as she let her fingers move across the invisible keys of her mind. The truth was, she had a dream, a big dream. She wanted to play for an audience, to let her music fill a room, to share a piece of herself with the world. But how could she? How could she let herself be seen when she was so afraid of being judged, of being laughed at? Every time she thought about it, the fear was overwhelming. So she kept quiet. She kept it to herself, safely hidden behind a wall of doubt. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't going to be content sitting in the corner forever. The music inside her was growing louder, and the dream she tried to bury was starting to push against the walls she had built around it. She could feel it like a spark, a quiet flame, ready to burn bright. But how could she step forward? How could she overcome the fear that kept her so firmly in the shadows? She looked around the room again, her eyes scanning the faces of the people around her. They were all so confident, so sure of themselves. She couldn't help but wonder, what would it be like to be like them? To stand tall, to speak up, To share her music without hesitation? For now, she stayed silent, her dream just a whisper in the back of her mind. But that whisper was growing louder, and sooner or later she would have to listen. Tonight it was. Just another party? Just another group of people she didn't quite fit in with? But the piano was waiting. And for the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop hiding. The dismissal, the room buzzed with the energy of laughter and clinking glasses. But she sat quietly, a silent observer of the scene. Unfolding around her, it was one of those parties that seemed to have no real purpose beyond the noise and socializing. People were telling stories, boasting about their latest achievements, or talking about their exciting plans for the future. It was the kind of conversation that made her feel invisible, like a shadow in a room full of light. She had tried to contribute earlier, to join in the lively discussion, but her words had felt small, insignificant, swallowed up by the louder voices that filled the air. So she had quietly withdrawn, slipping into the background once again, her thoughts drifting back to her music. The piano. Her secret dream. Someone from the other side of the room laughed loudly, drawing attention. It was the kind of laugh that made everyone else stop talking for a moment just to hear it. Ava couldn't help but glance over, curious. The man who was telling some outrageous story about a trip he had taken caught her eye, and for a brief moment their gazes met. She quickly looked away, embarrassed. She wasn't interested in his stories. She wasn't interested in any of it. She didn't belong in that conversation. She was just the quiet woman in the corner, a shadow. And then, as if on cue, someone in the group turned the conversation to our dreams and ambitions. One of the women, her voice loud and confident, spoke up. "What about you, Ava?" she asked, smiling brightly. "What are your big plans? What's your dream?" Ava hesitated, the familiar wave of self-doubt washing over her. What could she say? She wasn't like the others, brimming with boldness, with stories of success and future glories. She had a dream, but it felt too small, too fragile to share. What if they laughed? What if they didn't take her seriously? She took a deep breath, trying to push the fear down. I want to play music, she said, her voice almost a whisper. I dream of playing the piano for an audience, maybe even professionally one day. The group went quiet for a brief moment, and she could feel the weight of their eyes on her. It wasn't the kind of silence that came with curiosity or interest. No. This was a silence filled with polite confusion. The woman who had asked the question raised an eyebrow and then let out a soft, surprised laugh. "A pianist?" she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "But, don't you have to, really be talented for that? Like a real musician?" The words hung in the air like a heavy stone. The room seemed to shift slightly, the energy changing from light and carefree to something colder, more judgmental. She felt the blood rush to her face as the group chuckled, some people exchanging glances. They weren't laughing cruelly, but the laughter was dismissive, casual, like they couldn't even begin to understand why she would dream of something so impractical. "Yeah, another person chimed in. It's not like people just get to play for crowds without years of training, right?" "Right," someone else added. "And even then, you have to be really good, famous or something." The group nodded in agreement, all of them laughing lightly, as if the idea of a quiet woman like her being a successful pianist was laughable. Ava felt her chest tighten, her breath becoming shallow. She forced a smile, but it didn't feel real. The weight of their dismissal pressed on her, heavier than any compliment would have been. They didn't understand. They couldn't. How could they? They were all too busy with their own stories to see that her dream mattered. Her hands, still holding her drink, began to tremble. The conversation continued around her, but it felt muffled, distant. She was in the room, but she wasn't a part of it. They didn't see her for who she really was. They saw a woman who dreamed too big, too foolishly, and she could feel that judgment in every word that followed. She wanted to get up, to leave, to escape back to her quiet life. She didn't. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on the floor, wishing the ground would swallow her up. How had she let herself think for even a moment that her dream was worth sharing? Maybe they were right. Maybe it was foolish to want something so unrealistic. Maybe she was just meant to sit quietly in the corner, a dreamer who would never be seen. But even as the doubt crept in, she couldn't quite silence the voice inside her, the voice that whispered of the piano, of her music, of the dream that still lived quietly but persistently inside her heart. The night continued. People laughed, they drank, they talked. But Ava didn't hear them anymore. She was lost in her thoughts. A quiet dreamer surrounded by noise, wondering if she would ever have the courage to prove them wrong. The secret practice the party had ended. Ava found herself back in the familiar quiet of her apartment, the soft hum of the city below providing a gentle backdrop to her thoughts. The laughter and chatter from the evening still echoed in her mind, but it was already fading, becoming just another memory. Her fingers found their way to the piano, as they always did after a long day. The old instrument sat there in the corner of the room, a silent companion to her dreams. Unlike the noise and chaos of the evening, the piano offered peace. It was a place where she could escape into the music and leave the world behind. She hadn't told anyone, but playing the piano was the one thing that made her feel truly alive. It was the only time she could be herself without fear, without judgment. The sound of her fingers on the keys was a kind of freedom each note. Telling a story she couldn't speak aloud, she settled onto the piano bench, her hands resting gently on the keys, feeling the familiar coolness beneath her fingertips. Ava didn't play with an audience in mind. She didn't play to impress anyone. She played because it was the only thing that felt real. Her dreams, her big, impossible dreams of playing in front of a crowd, of sharing her music with the world, seemed too far away, too out of reach. But here in this room, in the privacy of her own space, she could let go of the fear. She could dream in peace. The sound of the first few notes filled the room, delicate and soft, a reflection of the uncertainty she still carried. It was almost as if the piano was a mirror, showing her the parts of herself she kept hidden, the dreams that had been crushed by the laughter of others, the insecurities that kept her locked away. She played the same melody again and again, repeating the familiar tune like a form of comfort. Each repetition felt like a step toward something, though she wasn't sure what. As her fingers glided over the keys, Ava's thoughts drifted back to the party. The laughter, the dismissive comments about her dream, it all stung. She had been so vulnerable, so open for just a moment, and in return, she had been met with indifference. They hadn't understood her. But, somehow, their laughter only strengthened her resolve to continue. If they couldn't see it, that didn't mean it wasn't worth pursuing. The quiet in the room felt safe, but it also reminded her of the barriers she had built around herself. She had grown used to being invisible, to hiding in the background, to letting her dreams stay locked away in the shadows. But that night, after hearing their laughter, something inside her had shifted. It was a small spark, barely noticeable, but it was there. It was the spark of defiance, the quiet voice that said, maybe it's time to stop hiding. Her fingers moved faster now, more confident, the music filling the room with its energy. The soft melody transformed into something more powerful, more urgent, as though she was playing not just for herself, but for the future she wanted to create. She could hear the echoes of their laughter in her mind, but she didn't stop. She played louder, letting the notes fill the space, drowning out the voices that had tried to tell her that her dream was too big, too foolish. With each note, she felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. The fear, the self-doubt, it was still there, but it didn't feel so heavy anymore. More than she could see the dream clearly now, more than she had ever seen it before. It wasn't just some fantasy. It was a goal, something worth fighting for. As the music filled the apartment, Ava felt the connection between her and the piano growing stronger. It wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was a bridge between her and the person she wanted to become. The quiet woman in the corner, her fears, her insecurities, were slowly being replaced with something more powerful. With each note, she was becoming the person who could stand tall, who could face the world and show them her dream without fear. She didn't know when it happened, but somewhere between the rise and fall of the music, she stopped doubting herself. The melody had a life of its own, and with it, her dream began to feel real again. This was more than just practice. This was the beginning of something, the start of something she had hidden for far too long. When the final note faded, leaving only silence behind, she sat back, her fingers resting on the keys, her heart pounding. In her chest, it wasn't just a song anymore. It was a declaration. Ava had spent so many years hiding in the shadows, afraid to share her dreams with anyone. But tonight something had changed. The music had filled her with a sense of purpose, and for the first time, she felt ready. Ready to stop hiding. Ready to share her music with the world. Ready to make her dream real. And it all started with the quiet secret practice in the corner of her apartment. The invitation Ava had nearly forgotten about the gathering until her phone buzzed the next morning, an unexpected message blinking on her screen. It was from an old friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in months. It was simple, but its implications were far greater than she realized. "Hey, we're hosting a small get-together tonight. Would love for you to come. We've got the piano in the living room if you want to play. No pressure, just thought you might enjoy it. Let me know." Ava stared at the screen for a few moments, her heart pounding as the words slowly registered. In her mind, the invitation wasn't a formal request, not by any means. But it carried something deeper, an opportunity she had never considered. The idea of playing for others was terrifying, almost unthinkable. She had never shared her music with anyone, not like this. It was always just for her. The thought of performing, even in a small, intimate setting, made her stomach twist with anxiety. But then she looked at the word piano. It's the same piano that had been a silent companion for so many years. The same piano that had heard her dreams, her fears, her hopes. Could she really go to this gathering? Could she bring herself to step out of her comfort zone and play in front of people who might not understand? She hesitated. The voice in her head, the one that had grown accustomed to her insecurities, told her to decline. To stay home, in the safety of the quiet. But there was another voice, a softer one, whispering against the noise. A voice that had been growing louder with every note she played. "What if this is your chance?" it said. "What if this is the moment that changes everything?" Ava's thumb hovered over the keyboard, and with a deep breath, she typed her reply, "I'll come, and I'll play." The decision felt like a quiet rebellion against her own fears. It was a small step, but for Ava, it was a giant leap toward something she had always kept hidden. She didn't know what would happen once she arrived. What? The reaction would be, but for the first time, the idea of playing for others didn't seem as impossible. As evening approached, the nerves began to set in. Ava paced in her apartment, unsure whether to even go. The invitation, so simple in words, now felt like a mountain she had to climb. She could already hear the laughter from the party, the conversation, the expectation. She wasn't ready to be seen, not like this. The familiar, comfortable silence of her apartment seemed so much easier to bear. But then, just as she was about to change her mind, something shifted inside her. She realized that this wasn't just about the party, or the people, or even the music hit. Was about her. This was her moment. Her chance to stop hiding. She could leave now, say she wasn't up for it, and go back to the quiet, safe world she knew. Or she could face the fear, the doubt, and walk into the unknown. She could choose to stop letting her dreams live in the shadows. She grabbed her coat and, without another thought, stepped out the door. When Ava arrived at the gathering, the familiar anxiety returned in full force. She stood at the door for a moment, feeling out of place, as the sounds of laughter and chatter drifted from the living room. It was nothing like her quiet home. This was a world of noise and people who seemed comfortable in it. Her heart raced, her palms sweaty, but there was no turning back now. A voice greeted her from inside, and she forced a smile, stepping into the room. The familiar faces of friends and acquaintances greeted her with warmth, but their conversations didn't seem to pause. People milled around, drinking and talking, and her piano sat in the corner untouched. Her gaze drifted toward it, her heart beating faster. The sight of it sent a wave of both comfort and fear crashing. Through her, the piano was waiting. But was she? Her friend, who had invited her, appeared at her side, a welcoming smile on their face. "I'm glad you came," they said. "The piano's all yours. Whenever you're ready. Ava swallowed, unsure how to respond. She hadn't expected such a warm reception, but the pressure was starting to feel real. She tried to hide her hesitation, but her fingers were already twitching, her mind racing with doubts. Could she really do this? Could she really step forward and play for these people, some of whom had laughed at her dream just days ago? Her friend continued, I know you've got something amazing to share. Should play for us. We're all here to enjoy the evening. But what would it be without some music? Ava felt her throat tighten. The words felt like a gentle push, but the weight of her own insecurity still held her back. No one's here for your music, she thought. We're here to have a good time, not to listen to a shy woman who's never performed in front of anyone. But then she remembered something, the music she had been practicing. Her fingers flying across the keys in the safety of her apartment. That music wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who needed to hear it, who needed to feel it. Maybe I'm not just playing for them, she realized. Maybe I'm playing for me too. With a deep breath, she turned toward the piano. The room fell away, and for a brief moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own heart pounding. Ava walked toward the piano, her steps slow but steady. The crowd behind her seemed distant, and the only thing that mattered now was the music. She sat down at the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys. The silence in the room seemed to stretch, and she wondered if she could even bring herself to play. But then, without another thought, she pressed her fingers to the keys. And just like that, everything changed. The first note, the moment Ava's fingers touched the keys, a rush of warmth flooded through her. The quiet silence of the room seemed to stretch and bend around her, amplifying the soft sound of the first note as it resonated through the space. It was delicate at first, hesitant, like the first step of someone learning how to stand. But as the melody began to form, she felt the music wrap itself around her, and suddenly, the weight of the world, the judgment, the laughter, the fear faded into nothingness. She wasn't playing for the crowd anymore. She wasn't trying to prove anything. The music was flowing from her fingers now, and it felt more like a conversation than a performance. The music knew her, understood her in a way that no words could. And for the first time that evening, Ava felt something she hadn't in a long time. Peace. As the first few notes drifted into the room, something shifted in the air. The chatter around her began to slow, and the murmurs became softer, like ripples in water. People started to turn, some quietly making their way toward the piano, while others simply stopped what they were doing, their attention now drawn to her. Ava didn't notice at first. She was too lost in the song, letting her fingers do the talking, her hands moving with confidence now, each note stronger than the last. There was a delicate tension in the air, quiet stillness that hovered just below the surface, like everyone in the room was holding their breath. Ava could feel their gaze on her, but it didn't scare her. It didn't overwhelm her. For the first time, their eyes weren't judging her. They were waiting for her to show them something, waiting for her to speak with the only language she knew, music. Her fingers danced across the keys, moving with purpose. It wasn't a performance in the traditional sense. There were no grand gestures, no need for perfection. It was raw, simple, and deeply personal. Ava played with an intensity she hadn't even known she had, letting the melody weave through the room like a thread connecting her to everyone around her. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She felt the room shift with her, felt the collective attention pull together, each person moving closer, drawn in by the melody. There was no need to force the music, no need to rush through it. The moment was unfolding. On its own, and for the first time, she was letting go of her fear. And then, something unexpected happened. She could feel it, a shift, subtle but powerful, in the room. The music had taken on a life of its own, but so had the audience. The laughter that once echoed through the space was replaced by a hushed reverence. No one was laughing now. No one was speaking. They were listening as the music wrapped around them, pulling them into the moment, and for a fleeting second, Ava realized something. She wasn't just playing for herself. She was playing for them too. Her song filled the room, quiet at first, but gradually building into something fuller, richer. It was as if each note unlocked a new layer of herself, peeling back the layers of doubt and insecurity she had been carrying for so long. With every chord, she was shedding a piece of her fear, her self-imposed limitations. And with every note, the audience wasn't just hearing her music, they were hearing her heart. Her soul laid bare before them. It wasn't a perfect performance. There were moments when her fingers stumbled, when the melody faltered, but it didn't matter. There was no judgment in the room, no expectation. They weren't waiting for a flawless performance. They were waiting for something real, something genuine. And that was exactly what Ava was giving them. She felt a sense of liberation, the kind she had never experienced before. As her hands continued to move across the keys, she was no longer the quiet woman hiding in the corner. She was the woman in the spotlight, and for the first time in her life, it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt right. She was doing what she was meant to do. She was sharing her dream. When the final note of the song lingered in the air, Ava let her fingers rest gently on the keys. A silence settled over the room, and for a moment, nothing moved. No one spoke. But the quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with something else, something deeper then. As if on cue, the room burst into applause. But this wasn't the kind of applause she had feared. It wasn't polite or forced. It wasn't the kind of applause one might give just out of social obligation. This was real, genuine. The kind of applause that acknowledged the courage it took to step forward and share something so personal, so vulnerable. Ava blinked, surprised by the reaction. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to be seen, to be heard in this way. She had played her music for herself. But now she realized something profound. Sharing it had connected her to others in a way she hadn't thought possible. Her heart was racing, but there was a smile tugging at her lips. She looked up for the first time, meeting the eyes of the people around her. They were smiling too, their faces filled with admiration and respect. She had done it. She had played not for approval or validation, but because the music inside her couldn't stay hidden anymore. And as the applause continued, Ava finally allowed herself to believe what she had always kept hidden. Her dream wasn't foolish. It wasn't impossible. It was real. And in that moment, she knew this was just the beginning. The surprising silence, the applause rang in her ears, but it wasn't the thunderous clapping she had expected. It was softer, gentler, like a quiet acknowledgement from the room, rather than an overwhelming cheer, kind of applause that wasn't just for a good performance, but for something deeper, something that resonated with everyone who had just witnessed a moment of transformation. Ava's heart pounded in her chest, and for a second she couldn't breathe. Prepared for this. She hadn't been prepared for people to listen to, actually hear her. The music had been for her a private expression of her deepest, quietest dreams, but somehow in that moment, it had reached everyone around her. And as the clapping continued, a strange feeling washed over her. It wasn't pride or relief. It was more like a soft surrender, as though she had finally allowed herself to be seen. And then, the silence. It came in waves, so sudden that it almost felt like a pause in time. The room, which had been filled with applause just moments ago, became still. Ava's fingers rested on the keys, almost as if waiting for something to happen, something more. The applause had died down, but there was an energy that lingered in the air, an energy that was almost palpable. The room had shifted. The noise, the conversations, everything around her had quieted down in a way that was so unexpected, it felt like a new layer had just been uncovered. Her heart, still racing from the adrenaline of the moment, began to slow. She glanced up, still uncertain, trying to gauge the mood of the room. And then she noticed something. People weren't rushing to speak. No one was filling the silence with words. They were just standing there, some in the same spot they had been when she finished playing, others closer to the piano now, watching her with expressions of wonder and something else, curiosity. Their eyes weren't filled with judgment or expectation anymore. There was something different in them. It wasn't until she looked directly at one of the people near the back of the room that she saw it clearly. It was the man who had been so quick to dismiss her dream earlier, the one who had laughed with the group about how impractical her goal was. He was standing there now, his face unreadable. His arms were crossed, but there was no sign of mockery, no chuckling. Looked at her, his gaze steady, as if something had clicked for him, as if he had just realized something about her. Ava shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do with the sudden attention. The silence, which had felt so heavy at first, was starting to feel like a weight lifting off her shoulders. She had no idea how long the room would stay in this quiet. Suspended moment? Would it go back to the usual chatter? Or was this silence a sign of something deeper? Then, softly, one person spoke. It was the woman who had encouraged her to play earlier, the one who had known how much the piano meant to her. She wasn't clapping anymore, but there was something in her voice that felt different, warmer, more sincere. That was beautiful. She said, her words carrying a weight Ava wasn't used to hearing from her. I had no idea you could play like that. Ava's heart skipped. She wasn't sure if it was the comment itself or the tone in which it was said. Genuine, unforced, and completely open. For the first time, she realized that she wasn't being humored. The music had moved people. She had moved them. The room, once quiet and still, slowly began to fill with murmurs. But it wasn't the usual chatter. It was a soft exchange of surprised reactions, thoughtful comments, and quiet compliments. There was no rush to fill the space with loud voices. No one was hurrying to move on from the moment. Instead, they seemed to be allowing the music to linger, giving it the room it needed to settle into their minds. Ava couldn't help but smile softly, a little unsure of herself. But something inside her felt lighter, like a burden had been lifted. She had always feared being seen as small or unimportant, but now she could feel something new, respect. Not just for her music, but for her courage. The silence in the room wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was thoughtful, reflective. Music had created a connection between them all, and Ava felt the truth of it deep in her chest. For once, she didn't feel like she was chasing an impossible dream. She felt like she was on the edge of something real. The fear, the doubt, the laughter that had once haunted her, they had faded, replaced by something much more powerful. The recognition that she had shared something true. Something that had connected her with these people in a way she had never imagined. The man who had stood back and observed from a distance took a step forward now. His eyes met hers, and this time, there was no sarcasm or mockery in his gaze. Instead, there was something like respect. Something that had been earned, not through words, but through the act of sharing her music. Ava didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded, acknowledging the silence in the room, the connection they had all just experienced. She hadn't expected this moment, hadn't expected the room to fall silent in the way it had. But now that it had, she realized something. The silence wasn't an absence of sound, it was an invitation. The music had opened the door. And now, for the first time, she was ready to step through. The turning point, the last note of her song, faded, its echo lingering in the room like a ghost. And with it, Ava felt something shift. The applause, once hesitant, now grew louder. But it wasn't just the clapping that struck hurt, it was the energy in the room. It was as if the very air around her had changed. The silence before had been a quiet waiting. But this applause, soft at first, built into something real. It wasn't out of obligation, and it wasn't a polite response to a performance. It was raw, it was genuine, and it felt like a bridge had been built between her and everyone in the room. Ava's hand stayed resting on the keys. Her fingers, unmoving, almost frozen by the realization that she had just done something monumental. She hadn't just played the piano, she had shared a piece of herself, and in doing so, something had happened. She was no longer that quiet woman who kept her dreams hidden away. She had taken that first step into the unknown, and the world hadn't rejected her. It had embraced her. She glanced up slowly, taking in the faces around her. Some were smiling, others simply staring at her in awe. The man who had dismissed her dream earlier stood near the back, his arms crossed, but now his posture was different. There was no mockery in his eyes, no dismissive grin. Instead, there was a look of respect, something Ava hadn't even known he was capable of giving. He nodded once, his expression softened, as if silently acknowledging something that had shifted in both of them. For a moment, Ave was overcome with a quiet sense of disbelief. Could it be that her music had really done this? Had she truly connected? With them, with the room, in a way she'd never thought possible? She was still seated at the piano. But it felt like she was standing in the center of a new world, a world that wasn't defined by the boundaries she had set for herself. It wasn't just about the music, it was about being seen. For the first time, she wasn't just the quiet woman in the corner. She was someone who had something valuable to offer, someone whose voice was worth listening to. The woman who had encouraged her to play earlier was the first to approach. Shining with admiration. "That was incredible," she said, her voice soft but full of emotion. "I don't think any of us expected that. You've got something real here." Ava didn't know what to say. Words felt inadequate compared to the rush of emotions that were swirling inside her. She had been so afraid of failure, afraid of judgment. But now she realized there was no failure in what she had just done. There was only connection. The room had listened, and in doing so, they had given her the validation she had spent years searching for. But it wasn't the kind of validation that came from applause or praise. It was the kind that came from stepping into the light, from being brave enough to share a piece of her soul. No matter the outcome, the group around her began to gather, each person offering a compliment or a shared look of appreciation. They spoke about the music, about how it made them feel, how it had drawn them in and connected them in a way they hadn't expected. For the first time, Ava realized that her music had done more than entertain. They had felt it, and in return, they had given her something back. The applause faded, but the energy in the room didn't. It hung there, tangible, like a thread woven between them all. There was a change in the air. They weren't just the strangers who had laughed at her dream. They were people who had witnessed something real, something they could no longer ignore. Ava had stepped out of the shadows, and they were all now part of her story. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about the courage to stand up, to show the world something real, to not let fear control her any longer. And as she looked at the faces around her, she realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when she stopped hiding and started living her truth. For the first time, she felt that her dreams weren't foolish. They weren't impossible. They were something worth pursuing, something worth sharing. Ava wasn't just a quiet observer anymore. She had found her voice, and the world had heard it. The rebirth of confidence the room had quieted now, the last of the applause fading into murmurs of quiet conversation. Ava remained at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, unsure of what to do next. For a long moment she didn't move. It was as if time had slowed and the weight of the moment had anchored her to that spot, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had just shifted within her. She wasn't just the woman who had played a song. She was someone who had broken free from the chains of self-doubt. Someone who had stepped into the light despite every fear that had once held her back. Her hands lingered on the piano, but her mind was elsewhere. She was still processing the warmth of the room, the feeling of being seen not just for her talent, but for her courage. Her dream had once felt so fragile, so out of reach. Yet here she was, not just sharing her music, but claiming her place in the world, one note at a time. The conversations around her had shifted, the once casual chatter now full of respect. People approached her with genuine interest, offering praise not just for her performance, but for the vulnerability she had shown. It wasn't the usual polite compliments she was used to. These were real, grounded in something deeper, something that felt meaningful. A man from the crowd, who had been quiet until now, came over to her. He wasn't one of the loudest, nor had he been part of the earlier conversation. There was something about the way he approached her that caught her attention. He was taller than most, and his posture was open, welcoming. Without hesitation, he extended his hand to her. "Hey." Quiet gesture that felt almost like a challenge. "That was incredible," he said, his voice sincere, not overly dramatic, but filled with quiet admiration. "You've got a real gift, and the courage to show it. That's rare." Ava felt the words sink into her like a quiet reassurance. His respect wasn't just for her music. It was for the courage it had taken to step forward, to share herself with a room full of strangers who had once dismissed her dream. She had feared being laughed at, but now she felt the weight of that. Fear lift, replaced by something more powerful, something that felt like freedom. Another person, a woman she barely knew, came forward next. I honestly didn't know what to expect, but that was... She paused, shaking her head in disbelief. That was real. You made us feel it. The music wasn't just notes, it was like it spoke to us. Ava smiled softly, unsure of how to respond. Words didn't feel enough, not after what had just happened. She wanted to say something profound, something to reflect the deep gratitude that was bubbling inside her. But she realized that the moment didn't need words. It was enough to let the silence hang for a while, to let the weight of the music, the energy in the room, speak for itself. And then, as if the last piece of the puzzle had clicked into place, she realized something that had eluded her for years. The applause, the compliments, they weren't what had changed her. It was herself. She had stepped into that room as a quiet dreamer, unsure of her place in the world, and had left it with something that felt like a rebirth, a new sense of confidence, of self-worth, of possibility. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being authentic. The people around her weren't just reacting to her music anymore. They were reacting to the bravery it had taken to show up, to stop hiding, to embrace her dream despite the doubts that once held her back. Ava realized, as she looked around at the people who had once laughed at her dream, that their opinions no longer had the power to define her. She had defined herself. For the first time, she felt at home with her own dream, no longer a prisoner of the judgment of others. There was still fear, of course, fear of failure, of the unknown, but it was no longer the paralyzing fear that had once kept her hidden. It was the kind of fear that fueled her, that pushed her to keep going, to keep playing, to keep sharing her truth with the world. And as the night wore on, and people came and went, Ava realized something else. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. The music had already done that. The room, once filled with doubt, had transformed into a space of shared understanding. She wasn't just Ava, the quiet woman in the corner anymore. She was Ava, the musician, the dreamer, the woman who had taken her place in the world unapologetically. As she left the party later that night, the streetlights flickering softly, in the distance, Ava felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. The kind of peace that comes with accepting yourself, with letting go of the fear of what others think, with embracing the idea that your dreams are yours to chase, no matter what anyone else believes. She had taken the first step into a new world, and the best part, it was only the beginning. The next step, Ava stepped out into the cool night air, the weight of the evening still hanging around her like a warm embrace. The noise of the party, the laughter, the conversations had already faded, but the quiet hum of her own thoughts followed her down the street. Her footsteps echoed softly on the pavement, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the urge to retreat. She didn't feel like she needed to hide from the world or shrink away into the shadows. The music was still with her, like an invisible thread pulling her forward, reminding her that she had shared something real, something important. For the first time, Ava realized that her music wasn't just a personal expression. It was a way of connecting with others, of bridging the gap between herself and the world. And the applause, the compliments, the respect she had received, they weren't the things that mattered most. What mattered was the courage to let herself be seen, the strength it took to step into her own light. As she walked down the quiet street, a strange sense of calm washed over her. The old doubts, the fear of being judged, of being laughed at, those things felt distant now. They had no place in her future. What mattered now was the possibility that had opened up before her, the endless doors waiting to be unlocked. The future no longer seemed so impossible. It was full of promise, full of potential. And for the first time in a long time, she was ready to walk through those doors. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her from her thoughts. She pulled it out, and there was a message from her friend, the one who had invited her to the party. It was simple, but it made Ava's heart skip a beat. Tonight was amazing. You were incredible. I think you need to start playing more. This is just the beginning for you. A smile tugged at Ava's lips as she typed a quick reply. I think you're right. She paused before hitting send, her finger hovering over the screen. For the first time, she wasn't worried about what other people thought. She wasn't worried about whether or not she was good enough because she already knew. She knew her music was worth sharing, and that was enough. As she hit send, Ava realized something that made her chest swell with a quiet, deep pride. This wasn't just about being seen or applauded. This was about her own belief in herself. It had taken years, but she had finally stepped into the person she had always wanted to be. And the best part? She didn't need permission from anyone. She didn't need anyone's approval to follow her dreams. The next step was hers to take, and no one could stop her now. She walked a little faster, the night air feeling fresher with every step. She could almost hear the faint echoes of the piano in her mind, as though the music was all ready, leading her down the path she was meant to walk. There would be obstacles, of course. There would be doubts and setbacks, just as there always had been. But now, Ava knew she could face them. She had proven to herself, in that room full of people, that her dream was real and nothing would take it away. The future was no longer a distant fantasy. It was something she could touch, something she could shape with her own hands. The next step was just waiting for her to take it. So she walked on, her steps steady and sure, knowing that whatever came next, she was ready. And with that, Ava understood. The music didn't just belong to the piano. It belonged to her, and it was the key to everything she would become.